Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And when we started Tortoise, when we started a slow newsroom with an idea that we would have these open editorial conferences, what we call think-ins, at the start of them, someone said to me, you know, the problem with this idea is that you say you're going to come to these big problems, big themes, big questions in our world with an open mind. But the truth is you've always got an agenda. You're always going to be trying to shoehorn what people say into what you think already. Well, I want you to witness, or at least hope you will witness and take part in the coming hour of discussion about loneliness as proof that the whole nature of this different kind of open journalism is that we can be informed by what we hear from a variety of people, not just the extraordinary experts we've got together this evening, but by all of us. And I give you this rather circuitous introduction this evening because as I was coming to this today, I was thinking there are a few subjects that fascinate me more, alarm me more, test the way I think about our society more than the subject of loneliness. And there are a few subjects in which I am completely convinced that I don't really know my own mind. I don't actually know what I think and how you address it. And I suppose it's for these reasons. Loneliness feels like the absolute essence of the paradox of progress. How is it that we can have more material prosperity, greater technological empowerment, and yet feel personally weaker, less connected? How is it that we can feel, or at least be told that we are gaining more, but somehow be experiencing less of life? And in this evening's thinking, what we hope to do is try to tackle this subject in two halves. One is in the company of Baroness Barran, the Minister for Civil Society and for Civil Society, and who's been really at the forefront of government thinking. Hello, Diana, thank you for joining us. At the forefront of what's really a revolution in government, an attempt to try and fix some of these social bonds and community threads that for a long time were not really thought of as the preserve of government at all. We're joined by Noreena Hertz. Noreena is, I like to say a journalist, but the truth is she's a cut above the rest of us in that her journalism, her writing and reporting for years now, Noreena, has been about these really big themes and trends. I say that because when I was at the Financial Times, I was copying your work on anti-globalization, and I now realize that at Tortoise, I'm going to be copying your work on loneliness. Noreena Hertz is here to talk to us too. And we're also delighted that Christina Victor, Christina, are you there? Who's a professor of gerontology and public health at Brunel, I think you're in that perfect intersection, Christina, of academic, so we're hoping for insight, but also campaigner, so we're hoping for some ideas of how we address and fix this problem. So we've got an extraordinary group of people. My colleague Ella Hill, who is marshalling the conversation this evening in the chat, has also helped produce these brilliant slides that you saw just as we started. I'll come to Ella. Hi Ella, how are you? We'll come to Ella in a bit just to sort of talk through what those data points tell us. But most importantly, to reiterate, a think-in is a forum for civilized disagreement. It's a place where we are informed by everyone in the room, now the digital room, and critical to that is that we don't need sort of statements posing as questions. It's the reason we don't have questions. What we really want is people's points of view, personal experiences, own expertise to weigh in and help us think through how do we live with loneliness. So with that long and rather baroque introduction out of the way, let's get to the substance of it. Noreena, I'm going to ask everyone to be let off skimming through your book while we're discussing, because I'm going to ask you to skim through your book. Noreena has published this book. I'm just going to give it a shameless plug, Noreena. It's called The Lonely Century. And I know you look pleased because you've got a copy on your shelf, but I've actually got two. So I'm just extremely pleased to be a jump ahead of you. Tell us tell us your analysis of why we're seeing what you call the lonely century. Why are we seeing a spike in loneliness now, and who is it hitting and why?
Well, I think first, we need to acknowledge the scale of the problem, because it really can't be overstated. You showed some really useful slides. 60% of British employees feel lonely at work. 1 in 5 British adults feel lonely most or all of the time. This is before the pandemic. 1 in 8 Brits said that they didn't have a single friend that they could rely on. I crisscrossed the globe meeting in America, for example, people who were so lonely that they were paying to rent a friend or be cuddled. So the scale of the problem is immense, and it's affecting our health. And maybe it's something we'll talk about. It's affecting the economy, costing the NHS over £2 billion a year, just dealing with over 50s loneliness. And it's also, I argue, affecting our democracy. The drivers are multiple. Technology, clearly, I believe, part of the problem. Our smartphones and social media making us perma-connected, yet perma-distracted, together, yet alone. And the research, I think, is now pretty compelling that builds the case between the rise in loneliness and the rise in social media usage, but also the way we now live, mass migration to cities, leaving swathes of urbanites who don't know their neighbours, and rural communities often feeling disconnected and abandoned by those who have left. People do less together than they did even a decade ago. Go to church less, go to synagogue less, eat together less, live together less, all than more than a decade ago. And there's also what we might think of as the neoliberal mindset, a mindset really that took hold in the 1980s and kind of gathered steam, in which increasingly we came to see ourselves very much as hyper-individualistic, competitive people, hustlers, not helpers, takers, not givers, hoarders, not sharers. And with these qualities being qualities kind of valorized really around us, qualities which arguably were never going to make the world feel more cohesive, and inevitably would lead to more loneliness. You even fascinatingly see this in pop song lyrics. If you look at pop song lyrics from the 1980s onwards, you see that words like we, our, and us supplanted through the decades with I, me, and my. So an I-focused society was always inevitably going to be a lonely one. These are just a few of the reasons, but basically structural drivers for sure, technological, economic, and political, as well as the things we ourselves have done and do.
So Noreena, can we just take those two elements of it? Because I think people will instinctively understand the technology side of this. You know, you're stuck in your phone, you're not connecting with people, you've got all of the issues that people know about social exclusion online. The neoliberalism argument is not as self-evident in the sense that actually many people will argue that one person's neoliberalism is another person's globalization. That has created greater connectivity, greater chances to meet real people in other countries in terms of travel and business, real chances for people to study together and learn together. There are connections and opportunities created by the modern marketplace that were not available 30, 60, 100 years ago. So why is it that neoliberalism contributes to this idea of loneliness? Not disempowerment. Disempowerment I understand, but loneliness.
Yes. So first of all, I'm pro-globalization and I'm not anti-capitalist, but what I'm talking about here is a particular form of capitalism, a particularly harsh form of capitalism that really took hold in the 1980s and then kind of became the norm, really since adopted by parties of the left as well as parties of the right. A particular form of capitalism that really decoupled the economy from society and lionized the individual and kind of told us that we had to look after ourselves. It's not that we shouldn't do things ourselves. That isn't what I'm saying. It's that we increasingly were told that that was what we should do, and also the state wouldn't necessarily be there for us. And of course, if you think that all you have to rely on is yourself when times are tough, well, you're going to feel more alone. And you see, when I think about loneliness, I don't just think about it in its traditional sense, which is about feeling bereft of friends, company, intimacy. I also think of loneliness as feeling disconnected from our politicians and politics. It's about feeling unsupported and uncared for by government or our employer. And I think when we look at loneliness in that broader sense, then I think we can see that the environment in which we've lived in has been one in which care and compassion and kindness have not been traits that have been valued. And as part of my research, I just did a very kind of simple exercise. I looked at jobs on a leading jobs website that specify care, kindness, and compared what they pay compared to the market average. And, you know, it was just clear example of how the market really has never valued care and kindness. And that being so, inevitably, society was going to feel more lonely.
Noreena, it's so interesting. This, I mean, as you say this, you remind me. I had a conversation once about AI, about technology, with all people Bill Gates, and he said the most amazing thing. He was asking about what jobs robots could and couldn't do. And he said, you know, sooner or later we will develop a robot that can do the most difficult job there is to do. And I said, oh, what is that, the most difficult job there is? And he said, it's to pick up a patient and carry them sensibly downstairs from one bed to another. And at the time I thought to myself, that's so interesting that someone like that would think actually the most difficult job there is something that is a job of care, having those sensitivities. It's so, and it's not, of course, as you say, valued in the market.
No, but interestingly, I do see, and I found in my research, that I do believe actually that the market does have a part to play in the solutions, and AI is actually a space where I think the market does have a role to play. We've seen in Japan a significant take up of robot carers and social robots, with those they care for, getting really attached to them, elderly women knitting bonnets for their robot carers. And I've seen examples of robots that were sent to Americans, to elderly Americans during lockdown there. And people who were sent these robots saying that these robots have really been their friends and made them feel less isolated. So I think the market does have actually a positive role to play in this regard, interestingly.
Well, let's come to that. I'm doing a terrible job at this because I can see already there's just a slew of people with thoughts about the impact of working from home and the pandemic and personal experience of being alone versus loneliness. But I'm going to come to you all in a moment. But I would actually like to just take a bit of time, you know, listening to Baroness Barran and to Christina Victor too, just to get an understanding of what you think's at play here. And Baroness Barran, Diana, can you pick up where Noreena left off? What do you think's going on here?
Well, I think Noreena made some very good points, and I think one of the things she said towards the end of her remarks I'd jotted down just sort of in anticipation of this question, which is somewhere along the way we've stopped valuing connection. So if we think of some of the stuff we know about how we're wired as human beings, that fear of abandonment is an absolutely fundamental fear that we are born with for all the reasons that we all know. And loneliness is obviously linked to a fear of abandonment. The other very primeval thing which drives us is that sense of losing control, and some of the anxiety, I think, that can go with loneliness. It also gives that feeling. So I think it's very deep rooted, and as a society, there are plenty of examples, sadly, of where we have started to lose and value that sense of connection. I suppose the optimist in me would say that COVID, in a way, has brought that into very stark relief. So whereas previously one might have thought this was something that happened to somebody else, actually, I would vouch there's nobody on this call who hasn't felt vulnerable and lonely during COVID, either personally or been deeply worried about someone they care about. So we have all felt it in a very experiential way over the past few months.
And Diana, can you just help us with a couple of things? There are quite a lot of people talking about the distinction in the chat as we're talking about this distinction between being alone and feeling lonely, about disconnection and social isolation. When you look at it, are you seeing a greater incidence of aloneness, people who are just not seeing other people, or are you seeing a greater instance of loneliness, people who may see other people but feel disconnected and isolated? It may be both.
Well, yeah, I mean, a bit unhelpfully, I think that one of the problems is just the accuracy of the data. So I think during the pandemic, we've seen three things, as I understand it. Those who've always been lonely and alone, and obviously Christina, with her perspective on the elderly, will have a lot to say on this, but you know, I try and talk to real people as often as I can, and it is really striking when you talk to people who haven't been outside their house for months. So that is still a big issue. The sense of disconnection, I think, in simplistic terms, is more of an issue for the young, but I think we've also got a group in the middle, if you like, who are the new lonely, who perhaps are single people who much of their network has been connected to their job, and who've been at home, and that has been a very stark and unpleasant experience.
And can I just press you on that question of the data? I'm really struck by this, and in fact, I mean, Ella might talk a little bit about it when she goes through the slides we've got, which is, I feel like we're grasping at pieces of incidental, sometimes anecdotal information and trying to weave a data picture out of them. Given how much concern there's been for a decade or more, Diana, about this loneliness issue, why is it that the data feels so inadequate?
Well, I mean, to be fair, the Office of National Statistics does capture data on this. I think all I'm trying to say is that particularly when you look at the over 75s, who, if I understood rightly, were on your slides, and certainly is familiar with the data I'm familiar with, report much lower levels of loneliness. That feels counterintuitive, I think, from everything we know. So I think there may be also social norms that make it harder to admit that you're lonely. For older people? Yeah.
Well, can I, it seems like perfect. I mean, Christina, given that this is your, I was going to say your mastermind subject, it's your mastermind subject and also your career. So I'm hoping you can help us with this. What is the truth? When we did that, as Ella, when she does the slide, will point out, we're really struck by the number of young people reporting loneliness. Is Diana right? Is the issue here underreporting amongst older people? What's the picture?
Well, it's complicated, and as an academic, I get paid to make the apparently simple much more complicated than you could ever believe. I think one of the issues around loneliness research was probably up till about 10 years ago, it was constructed as a social problem of old age. So we only ever asked questions about loneliness to old people. So I think it took us a long time as a society to realize that perhaps, despite the fact that all of us experience loneliness across our life course, to actually realize that loneliness wasn't an emotion exclusive to older adults. So I think we have been hidebound by our preconceptions as to who was a lonely person and who wasn't. And I have to say, as a gerontologist, it was somewhat disappointing to see that older people are the least lonely group in society, but never mind, I'm sure we can turn it around. And I don't think it is necessarily underreporting, actually, because the proportion of older people in Britain saying that they're lonely has remained absolutely constant since 1948. So either there's somehow we've trained people by the time they get to 65 not to report being lonely, or it hasn't changed. I actually think for older people, I won't say loneliness is something that they've learned to live with, but most people have experienced loneliness across the life course. By the time you get to be 60, 70, 80, I think a large proportion of people have developed coping mechanisms. So I was part of the BBC loneliness experiment. We got some interesting data there with people saying, when we asked them to talk about loneliness, saying, older people, well, you know, I've had it before, I've got it now, this is how I get over it, this is how I manage it. Whereas I think for younger people, it's perhaps more problematic. They haven't, it's a new experience, perhaps they haven't generated the coping skills. And I think there's probably a lot more pressure now than there was some time ago. So I think the other area where we have a problem in thinking about the data is sort of terminological inexactitude. People use terms like alone, lonely, isolated, interchangeably, and they're all subtly different.
Yes.
And so a lot of our data sets don't measure the same, don't ask the same questions. And one of the good things I'd like to congratulate the government on actually is having 2 standard measures of loneliness that we include in all of our studies. We can argue whether they're the right to, but in a sense that doesn't matter. We can now start to generate a better database.
So, Christina, I'd like to, I'm going to ask Ella just to go through those slides, if you will, just briefly, Ella. And then what I wanted to do, there was so much to get through here. I wanted to pick up a number of people, Christina, while you were talking. Paul Reeve, I saw, actually Jane Ann Fox has made an interesting point about her granddaughter and loneliness. And I'm struck too, Lillian has made a point about expecting to be lonely. So I'd like to talk a bit about that generational phenomenon and hear what you think. I'd also like to really begin to think about, okay, how do you address this problem personally and socially? And so we're going to come to that too and come back to you in a moment. But Ella, do you want to just take us through what the numbers, as far as the numbers can, tell us?
There we go.
There we are.
Sorry, thank you. So 1 second. So as Christina and Diana were saying, data shows that younger people, at least the ONS data, which is from their community life survey, shows that younger people tend to report feeling lonelier than older generations. And Christina and Diana spoke about why that might be. One of the things that I would say is that increased loneliness is often associated with major life transitions. Yeah. And for young people, there are lots of those: leaving school, moving out of the family home, starting university. But equally, there are a lot of those for older people. So retirement, again, you might move home, you might lose friends and spouses, you might become less mobile, for example, and those might increase your feelings of loneliness as well. Again, younger people reported that they felt more lonely during the coronavirus lockdowns in the UK. So about 52% of people aged 18 to 24 and 41% of people aged 25 to 34. And their increase in loneliness, again, might be associated with the fact that they're less used to spending time, isolated in their homes. And it could also be to do with things like feeling like they're in a precarious unemployment situation. Threats of job losses, for example, can increase feelings of loneliness. Frequent loneliness, as we see here, is associated with poorer physical and mental health. If you look at the purple band at the bottom of this slide on the right-hand side, that difference is really fairly pronounced. Cause and effect isn't exactly clear. Being in poor health is a factor that can contribute to socialization and loneliness and make socializing more difficult. and loneliness itself can be a cause of poor health. Recent research looking at physiological effects of loneliness finds that chronic loneliness is associated with things like elevated levels of stress hormones, for example, which can impact on health in a big way. One of the things that we wanted to look at in today's thinking is the impact of loneliness on our society and the job market and so on. And literature tells us that social isolation hinders your employment prospects. Good social connections are really, really important for getting a good job. And this data shows that social connections with family, friends, colleagues, friends of friends are still really important for job seekers. So if you look at the second, third and fourth, or the second, third and fourth bluish bubbles on the right-hand side there, you can see that a good percentage of people see their social connections as being the most important resource when they're looking for a job. This is a study that Noreena references in her book, where she's looking at the politics of loneliness, which I'm sure we will talk more about. And this data is from the American Family Survey, and it looked at the levels of social support sought by different supporters of candidates in the 2016 primaries. So compared to supporters of other political candidates, Trump supporters tended to prefer to rely just on themselves for family problems rather than reaching out to others. And the study defined this as self-reliance. And they found that people who were more self-reliant tended to be less likely to participate in communities like church groups, for example. So there might be a relation between social isolation and some of those voting patterns there.
Ella, thank you so much. One of the things I should just say, I thought about your book, Noreena, which I thought was so interesting, was this intersection between loneliness and politics, which I just hadn't seen coming at all. I'm going to come back to you on that if I may, but I said I'd start hearing from a whole group of people. I'm going to start, if I might, start with Jane Ann, if I can first. I'm going to come to Paul Reeve in a moment. I know Paul doesn't have a camera, but I still want to hear his view on what it is to be retired and home. Jane Ann, sorry, I'm now Jane Anning you. This is also informal now, the world of digital communication. But Jane Ann, your point in the chat was actually you were more worried, if I read it right, about your 17-year-old granddaughter and social isolation than you were about yourself. Is that right?
I think that's true, yes. I'm pretty outgoing, and I think that what happened during the COVID-19, although I'm completely isolated here with my dog, is it was a outreach in the neighborhood. Many of us experienced it. I'm in a small city, and people reached out to help me for various reasons. I have some disability issues, but my granddaughter has really struggled, and I can say to you that I'm pretty sure that the impact of an addiction to social media has made her situation worse. Now, this is a lay person, just someone who knows her. I love her very much. But we know that when the phone, Snapchat or whatever, when it pings the part of the brain that pings when you snort cocaine, basically. That's just put very, very simply. And so they become addicted to that dopamine, that little kick of that. And whereas when we take responsibility, again, this is a cartoon version, but when we take responsibility, every time we're given responsibility or we take responsibility of something, we get a bit of serotonin. Again, the scientists will tell me I don't have this exactly right, but just imagine, as I say, that it's a cartoon version. And I just don't think they have enough responsibility to feel good about themselves. So they're constantly trying to get it's a self-medication kind of thing by using the social media to make themselves feel better. But you know, it's a bucket with a hole in it. You can never fill it up. Right. And maybe children that grow up in families that have less resources, fewer resources, and have to do more, I do wonder if perhaps they feel better about themselves. When I was growing up, we had very little. I don't say nothing, you know, it used to be called genteel poverty, but I had to work and I had to take responsibility, and I had a very clear sense of myself. I don't see my grandchildren in London developing this because of the kind of lifestyle they live, and I think the addiction to media.
So Jenna, it's really interesting. I just want to say I've seen Emma's sort of impassioned argument for connectivity in the chat, and I'm going to come.
Oh, no question. But
in a moment, I see that too. I do just want to just sort of pursue just for a moment this generational question, because I understand. You know, Diana's point that when you see those numbers, they feel counterintuitive. I think it was Lillian, and I don't know whether Lillian, you can join us. I see Paul Reeves said, unfortunately, can't speak into his computer. So Lillian, are you there? I see you saying that you're retired. Hello there. Can we hear you? Yes, we can. Yes. Hello.
Okay, yeah, I'm unmuted. I think one of the things is, there's two things that happen with age, and although I retired fairly young, the first really is that you, by the time you're in your 50s and 60s, you've got older friends, you can see how they're cut off, you could also see what's happening to your parents. And so to some extent you expect to be lonelier, as you know, once you're out of the workplace and you're out of that constant stimulation. Consequently, if you're a fairly outward going person, it actually becomes easier to make friends as you get older, because you're all in the same boat. You've all lost partners, or you've all lost friends, or you've all moved away. And so it's actually, so that's offset by you finding it easier. So I think that the part of the issue is that, having seen the previous generation, you expect to be a little bit more lonely, but you also have communities of interest. And that was the other point I made, which is what has been absolutely devastating for older people during the coronavirus pandemic. In my case, it's classical music. And that, of course, has completely gone, completely wiped away. And so the communities of interest I have, not only because many people are shielding or concerned, have had to completely split up, because they're all made up of multiple households. Your children have moved away, your parents have gone, you may or may not have a partner. So I think one of the things that happens is that in a way you have less social contact, but you have less expectations of social contact. I think that was the point that I really wanted to make. However, in talking about loneliness and social contact, I think one of the things that we have got to bear in mind is this very fine tightrope between the village mentality and trying to steer between isolation. So you've got the sort of big city, the metropolitan thing, where you don't even know the people living on the same floor as you, as against the village mentality, when everybody knows precisely what you're doing, how many pints of beer you had last night, and who you're seeing. So
that may or may not be a good thing.
I think it's actually a complicated issue, but I do think that one of the things, the point that I made, is that I think with older people, it is possibly that they don't expect to have as much social contact, and I think that's probably quite a sad thing.
I've just seen the comment from James Pargester in the chat. James, I'm going to ask you for your experience on this, but can I just get some context from Christina? Christina, how much? Let's just talk about loneliness amongst older people. What's the read across of socioeconomic background, i.e., wealth, in terms of loneliness amongst older people?
So loneliness, like many other attributes in our society, is differentiated across the socioeconomic spectrum. So we can see that people who are better educated, who have more money, have had higher more skilled jobs are less likely to report loneliness in old age than their peers who are less privileged. So there's a definite profile, and we also see loneliness concentrated in communities in deprived areas.
So better educated versus less well educated, better off versus poorer, deprived areas versus, or wealthier areas versus deprived areas.
Yeah.
And what about the old city country? You know, we just touched on this idea of village and city.
Yeah.
Is urban loneliness more of a problem than rural loneliness, or is it pretty evenly spread?
Well, some work I've done with a colleague, we looked at differences in loneliness between urban and rural areas in Britain. And you could argue that, you know, in Britain, we don't really have any rural areas in the same way that you do in the States or Australia. In the UK, there's no difference between urban and rural areas for older people in the prevalence of loneliness. The association is with deprivation.
That's so interesting. Christine, that's so interesting. And one thing that we'll do, if we may, maybe even with your help, if we might, is actually update that data, because if we could produce some slides that actually showed that, that would be a really helpful.
Yeah, we've got a paper you can use.
Could do that. That gets better by the minute. I'm going to just, as I said, I'm going to come to James. James, I'm afraid I'm going to get your. Is it Pargeter or Pargeter? I don't know. But James, are you there? And just to. Obviously,
yes, I am. Yes, I am. Good evening, everyone. Yeah.
Hello. Yes. So tell us your experience of this.
Yes, I mean it's probably something I hadn't really thought about until this sort of pandemic and lockdown and things. My own situation, obviously, clearly I'm not a teenager. I was dabbling in social media before this year, but since lockdown, and I live on my own. I have been married, but my wife died 5 years ago. We didn't have children, so I found myself, you know, suddenly and kind of unexpectedly, I suppose, you know, alone, not traveling into an office environment every day, and actually for various reasons, you know, a couple of months ago I was made redundant from that. But yeah, again, a remote experience, which probably made it even worse. So. And I don't want to overplay that, because I think everyone has been affected adversely in the last few months. But it's just kind of brought home to me some of those sort of things that can impact you quite sort of heavily if they sort of you know particularly when they come out of the blue. But it's really reinforced for me the value of being around people on a daily basis. That's not, you know, they don't have to be close friends or people who are in a relationship with them, but just being around people, having sort of random discussions about sort of everyday things, rather than sort of, you know, formal conversations on a Zoom meeting or something. And I would just say, you know, I think probably I am now thinking I'm getting more and more addicted to social media, but I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think I've probably got to keep it sort of tempered. But actually, I have actually met some, you know, genuinely interesting people who I would probably, you know, classify as friends now. A couple of whom I've actually met in real life subsequent to actually sort of meeting them online. And I think that, you know, so social media, I think, can be genuinely sociable if it's used with the right attitude.
James, I'm going to come back to Diana Barran in a moment, but I just want to ask you, you know, the circumstances you describe are the experience of being alone, and not least in this year, even more so, both professionally and in terms of the experience of, you know, like everyone else, you know, having been locked down. Are there things that you have thought about when you think about the way of remedying this experience, making it work, that make you think, oh, if only we as a society did X, or if only my community did Y, or even if as individuals we learned to do Z, these things would make a difference to dealing with loneliness?
Yeah, I mean, it's not immediately apparent. I think actually one of the things that was good earlier on, and it's kind of sort of petered out a bit, was the the weekly clap for the NHS, and that actually did cause people to come out at 8, was it 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening, at a particular time every week. And first of all, it sort of started as a little bit embarrassed, but then people, and I knew a few of my neighbours, but not all of them. But actually, got to know a lot more of them, and actually, a sort of almost a virtual support group grew up within the road in which I live, and people were sort of looking out for each other and buying shopping for people who were sort of vulnerable and shielding and that sort of thing. But that was good for a while, but it's kind of died out, and I suppose it could be revived, and I shouldn't be looking for someone to do that for me, I guess. But
no, but I think we all look at it. I mean, I think we all need to figure out, and I'm particularly aware of it as we go into winter, ways that we orchestrate moments together. Otherwise, it's fearful that we won't have any. I'm going to actually ask this to the Minister for Civil Society, who I imagine spends more time than we do trying to figure this one out.
Yeah,
Anna, when you try and say, okay, look, putting aside the analysis of the problem, what capacity does government have, or the levers at government's disposal, to try and address this? How do you approach it?
Well, we try and approach it, I think, in 3 ways. And you made the remark, I'm not sure I jotted it down quite accurately at the beginning, about government getting into the human stuff, which obviously is a risky business. But I think we've focused on 3 things. The first is trying to reduce stigma around loneliness. So, the evidence suggests that just talking about it is helpful in alleviating the impact of loneliness. So making it okay to be lonely and not something to be ashamed of has been the first thing. We've done quite a few campaigns on social media in particular around that. And then the other thing, I think, is we've tried through our funding to support what I think Lillian described as communities of interest. So someone once said to me, if you're going to be successful as Minister for Loneliness, you've got to be able to think about getting your mother through the door. Well, we all think of our mothers, but my mother would have been hard to get through the door for something that had loneliness over the door. So actually, we've pursued a kind of Trojan horse strategy of funding activities that people enjoy. So whether it's a board games club, or men in sheds, or singing, or walking, or gardening, or football, or whatever it is, we've tried to support those hyper local, not very shiny, but absolutely organized by local people for local people, so that you go off and do something you enjoy, and guess what? You connect with people who share interests with you. So we steered away from funding stuff that says loneliness over the door, and rather tried to focus on stuff which says, if you walk through this door, metaphorically speaking, you'll have a good time, meet people with common interests and enjoy it. And then just briefly, most recently through COVID, we brought together a big network of academics, the social media companies, broadcasters, charities, and other businesses to try and see whether there's a way we can work together that helps tackle some of the issues that have arisen over COVID.
Diana, thank you. I want to, I said I was going to come back to Emma, who, since I see, is also, that actually the conversation about loneliness is actually making you feel worse. And Emma, I wonder whether that's because you feel as though the conversation is not really sort of understanding the issue, or because we've got the wrong end of the stick, that actually a lot of this digital connectivity is a really effective way of trying to help with the experience of being alone.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Tortoise, because this has been one of the ways generally that I felt less alone in the last few months, because I can see other people and I can have conversations. So mostly I'd like to actually praise what you've been doing. But I joined this particular event as someone who's felt lonely for most of their life, because I felt as if my experiences of that would be heard and listened to by a group of people who would be perhaps a bit kinder and more sympathetic. And I have actually felt a little bit some of the comments seem to not understand what loneliness means. And if you haven't experienced it yourself, I can understand how maybe you would struggle with that. But we aren't all,
Emma, just forgive me. What
cut
does
from
it
the
mean?
same cloth. And you know, all of the solutions and things that people talk about don't fit everyone. And you have to bear in mind that we're individuals, and what will work for some people won't work for others. And social media has been a complete lifeline for me and for many disabled people, for many neurodivergent people, for many people who are marginalized in society in lots of other ways. Social media is a way in which we can find each other, because you aren't constrained by geography. You don't have to live near people to be able to find people who are like you. And it's really important to acknowledge that, and to not just bash social media or online lives as being somehow not real and also somehow addictive, because I can go days without having any kind of communication with another adult. I'm parenting a teenager by myself, and we both have disabilities. I don't have family. I have very few friends, and neither of those things are my fault. And I feel like a lot of conversations around people who are lonely or alone make out as if somehow, you know, you're to blame for not reaching out, for not looking for connections, because being lonely is about not feeling understood. It's not actually a condition of being alone. It's a condition of not feeling that there are people in your life who understand you. And if you are not like a lot of people because you're built differently, or because you have illness or ill health, which makes it difficult to socialize in the real world. You know, I got very ill in my 20s and I felt abandoned by most of my friends, because most 20-year-olds, you know, people in their late 20s want to go out and get drunk and go dancing. And I wanted to be able to sit and have a cup of tea and a chat, because that's what I could manage. I think, you know, we need to extend an awful lot more kindness and listening and empathy to people who are not necessarily like you, who may not want the same things that you do, because I can be alone and feel totally happy with that. Or I can be in a group of people and feel incredibly lonely and vulnerable because I don't connect with those people. So,
and Emma, how would you use your experience? That's really good. I mean, by the way, you would blush if you saw all the things that people are saying about how wonderful it is, what you're saying. I've got a question. How would you use, someone I see here, Fabian McLaughlin, has written down what you said. Being alone is about not feeling understood. How will you use your experience itself as an act of kindness to try and help other people?
Well, it's, you know, on social media, you can find, you know, with long-term health problems, for example, on Facebook, there are groups for people with different illnesses, and you can talk to people and you can offer advice, and you can, you know, sympathize with people, and you can understand, and you can extend your experiences into other people's lives, and that kind of kindness. And it's also, when you see someone struggling, it's kind of saying, how are you today? You know, and online you can build friendships that are real and as valid as relationships that people have in the real world. And especially in the last 6 months, our real world is online. It's not outdoors. It's not doing, it's about taking you know, I because of my life experiences, when I see somebody online who says a particular thing, there are really wonderful people on Twitter who are, you know, Twitter can also be a hellfire of a site and full of nasty, particularly misogynistic abuse and Islamophobia abuse and racist abuse. But it can also be a place where you can find people who are kind and good and notice when you aren't there for a few days. And you know, because I do live alone with my teenager, and, you know, I feel as if actually I could drop, you know, I could fall down the stairs and break my neck. And some days people wouldn't even know.
Right.
There's my son peeping through the corner now, which is don't.
Hello there. Like dips in.
You know, and that can feel actually, it makes you feel incredibly vulnerable to feel lonely, and to admit to being lonely makes you vulnerable. And it's a hard thing to say, because not a lot of people actually really understand it, because they just think, oh, you're alone. And it's not. It's actually a condition of feeling that you're not heard or understood or important. And I think a terrific number of disabled people particularly have felt that. And during COVID, you know, a lot of the talk about, oh, well, it's older people, or it's, you know, people with, you know, they died with existing conditions. so what? We're still people.
Yeah.
We still matter. We still count.
Mm.
And all of that rhetoric that kind of comes out just makes you feel as if people don't care about what happens to you. And we've had 10 years of a government who have treated disabled people as if we are scum, basically. You know, I'm a disabled single parent to a disabled child. To a Tory, I am worth nothing.
So so the one thing I would say, and actually, I'm sure I'm going to do something most people would actually rather just hear you talk, because you can see in the chat. No, don't be bad, feel bad. But the one thing I should say is that if you want to be reminded that people do care, do just take a look at the chat as you were talking. It's quite a thing to see. I'm gonna press on just because we're running out of time. I want to do two things. I want to go back to take the flip side of what you said on social media and connectivity, if I might, Emma, and just go, I saw that Mark Selby made a point very early on about having worked for Nokia and having been excited about connectivity. And then he also, I think, made a point about, practically speaking, how we connect to people. And Mark, I don't know whether you're still there, whether you can just touch on those two things. Hello there. Oh, hold on one second, I can't hear you. No, I can hear you now. Yeah, now I've got you. Yeah.
Yes, so the point I was making was that those of us who worked in Nokia were really motivated by the goal of the company to connect people. Connecting people came up on everyone's Nokia phone at the time. And we went through a period where there was great benefit from connecting people, whether it was connecting farmers, fishermen, to the price of fish in markets, connecting them, people with each other. And just as Emma was saying, indebted to social media. I have a son with cerebral palsy. We only learned it was cerebral palsy because of online, and the support we got was phenomenal. And then gradually we started realizing that rather than having this wonderful goal of connecting people, we were actually disconnecting them, where people were addicted to their screens rather than talking with each other. And social media, I use it enormously. And one of the things I mentioned in the chat is just trying to understand what we can do about it, because being aware of this massive problem is very important. But the thing I've tried to do since March is I go through my contact list and I try to call 2 people on that contact list every day. If I can get hold of them, great. If I can't, forget it. And on average, I'm hitting about 7 people a week. And some of these people I've not spoken to for 10 years. Like today, I spoke to a guy I've not spoken to for 9 years, and he was cycling a bicycle in Liverpool, and we stopped by the side of the road, and we had a wonderful conversation. And the beauty of it is that you're just asking, how are you getting on?
Amazing.
And it's incredible how I found that simple little thing has helped in addressing loneliness where you're working from home, and also rekindling some human relations. And if other people can do it, please do. It really helps.
Mark, it's by the way, it's a really lovely thing to take something away that you can actually do. I think the thing that's so sometimes sort of bewildering and disempowering about these big social problems is you can't do anything. All right, I'm going to give it a try. I'll give it a try this week. I'll try a couple of people a day, and I'll send you a message to let you know how I get on. I'm going to come back in the final few moments, if I might, to Noreena Hertz. Noreena, there's a really interesting thing about your book, if I might, which was this connection you make between loneliness and politics, and itself, the way in which we've been polarized, and the sense of being, actually, to Emma's point, I wrote on what you said, not heard, not understood, and not important, and felt as though your life's not important, and that this plays out in our politics. And so I wonder, as we wind things up, Noreena, whether or not you'd sort of answer what we can do about this question in 2 parts. One is how loneliness is impacting our politics, but also how our politics can impact loneliness.
Well, my research, and again, we're talking on average here, but researchers as early as 1992 started seeing a link between people who felt socially isolated and people who are voting for right-wing populist parties. I'm not saying, of course, that everyone who is lonely is voting for right-wing populist parties, but they started seeing a link that on average, people were more likely to vote for right-wing populist parties if they felt isolated. Later research found that Trump voters not only were more likely to say that they relied on themselves, but had less friends and less acquaintances and saw them less regularly than voters for Hillary and supporters of Hillary or Bernie Sanders. And I crisscrossed the globe interviewing right-wing populist voters in America, in France, in Italy, and loneliness was one of their shared stories. And they talked to me about how they had found community in right-wing populist parties. They were lonely in the sense of feeling that they didn't have friends or a support network, but also lonely in this sense, James, that we've been talking about too, in the sense of feeling forsaken, invisible, powerless, abandoned, the kind of things that Emma was talking about too, a sense that especially by politicians, and of course, right-wing populists in particular have played very, very effectively to this. Speaking to the forgotten people is something that both Le Pen and Trump have said. But of course, this is on average. And thinking more broadly, I think there is a lot that government can do. And I think firstly, it's wonderful to hear of the initiatives that you are doing, Diana, and they are all, hugely important. But I think other things are needed too. We need to reinvest in the infrastructure of community, which really has been ravaged since 2008 under austerity. 800 public libraries closed down, a third of youth clubs closed down, elderly daycare centres closed down, community centres closed down. People need physical places where they can commune. And I think the government has a real role they could play there now. I think with new jobs, with all the jobs that unfortunately are going to be lost in the coming months and year, I think there is an opportunity here to create a new workforce of people who are specifically charged to help address loneliness and be there for others. I think governments can also play a role in valuing care more explicitly. It's not enough to cap for carers. We do need to give more cash to carers, especially as they are undervalued and underpaid. And I think we can learn from Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's really put addressing loneliness as well as other measures of well-being at the heart of the budgetary process now in New Zealand, looking not only at how the government is doing on traditional metrics like economic growth, but also on how well it's doing when it comes to tackling loneliness. And it would be brilliant if the UK could take that step too. So I think there's so much that we can do as individuals and should do. And there's so much that government can and should do too.
Noreena, thank you. All right, so I came into this thing, as I said, fascinated and bewildered. I come out even more fascinated and happily a little less bewildered. Thinking I should have said is like an editorial conference. At the end, the editor tries to pull together what the lines of it would be. Before I do that, I should say one thing. We're trialing, in the old world, when we used to meet in our Tortoise newsroom, one of the best things, in fact, many people said the best thing about a think-in was when it ended and you could just mill around and talk to people. And we're going to try that now so that when this ends, if you want to stick around and just chat to people and stick your hand up and pick up on something in the chat, there's more talking and listening and thinking to do. But I suppose that I come away struck by four things broadly. One is that actually the point that Noreena made right at the top, the scale of this is undeniable, and the causes of it are actually quite clear. That whether or not you're looking at even if you believe in the power of connectivity for good, you can also see in its power to disconnect and some of its social impacts too. So there's a technology issue. There's clearly a markets question. There's a question about consolidation of power and disempowerment as a consequence of that. There's clearly a big demography issue, not just about us living so much longer, but about everything taking longer. So we can see, I think, the structures behind loneliness. I'm really affected by what Christina says about the read across of socioeconomics and loneliness. We've got to acknowledge this. The simple point about high levels of loneliness in deprived areas. I think we need to map it, and then we need to think about how we address it. And I suppose I am really encouraged, I should say, by what Diana Barran says, in that when I started out as a reporter at the Financial Times, actually the centre of political gravity was against governments trying to intervene in areas that felt to be, the business of society. That was not the way in which we looked at government. And thinking about investment in hyperlocal, investment in community, investment in addressing the stigma seems like incredibly powerful and important things to do. I put on the to-do list, I suppose, these two central things, though. One is, if we are really going to go after stigma, then we have to go after the way in which that stigma is bedded into public spending and private markets. And the reality is that stigma is reflected in the way in which we spend, as Noreena just said, on care, but it's also reflected in the way in which we look the other way on the impacts that markets and tech are having. I do think, and I am touched by the thought that, Emma's example seems to me to be one. I loved her point about kindness, but how do you actually make that a common thread of the way in which we live and work? And part of it is creating these platforms that are designed for listening and understanding. And, we've seen that technologists can incentivize that behavior. I'm always struck by the difference between Reid Hoffman's LinkedIn and Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook, that you can incentivize certain behaviors if you build the tech right. And I saw that Sarah Gilmore on the chat is looking at building a new platform to connect people by their interests, for which good luck, and we'll follow it closely. And I'm also really specifically interested in what Maddie said, and forgive me, Maddie, I didn't see your name, about expectations and the way in which what we expect of young people is not necessarily to allow them to be, or to expect them to be, lonely. And I think that when we talk about stigma, we've got to address the way in which that actually operates in our society. And so I suppose those things I would take away. Others will take away different things. And if so, please do stick around for the next 10, 15 minutes and join us for a chat. I'll be slightly quieter than I have been in the last hour, so that other people can have their say. Diana or Christina, do you think there's anything on this that we, just because part of our thinking here is, okay, where could we take this that journalistically we could actually report it out as a story? I mean, one of the things Noreena does brilliantly in the book is she actually finds you stories. And I don't know whether, Diana, Christina, anyone else who's hanging around thinks, oh, there's a way that we could actually do this journalistically that's not sort of a bunch of stats or a kind of YOY piece of journalism.
Give us a couple of examples, James, about how, what are the kind of options that go through your mind? So I think that what happens with social policy journalism is that what you tend to get is what I think of as sort of, case study followed by stats, followed by three quotes from, sparing your blushes, the three of you, right? You get someone who's an academic, you get someone who's in the policy sphere, you get someone who's, reported out the issue. One of the things I think is really hard is to say, okay, how do we actually find something that's the thread of a story? And because what I think you're looking for are washing lines, really. The issues are so complicated, but you do want to follow someone's story through. So I'll give you an example of something I thought was really good. There was potentially an amazingly boring story about Frome a couple of years ago, about social policy intervention in Frome, right, in Somerset, which was actually amazing, totally fascinating, about how you recreate a community. But it did start with people, and it started with, I'm gonna get it wrong, but councils or community organizations, squabbling and trying to figure out their problems. It's that kind of thing where you can follow a story through time or a community of people. That's what I'm trying to figure out. So something I tried to do, but I'm sure you will do it much better than I did, was that I think it was on Radio 4, that program Chain Reaction. You talk to one person and then they recommend to the interviewer who they talk to next. So I've been trying to do something called Local Link, where I've been talking to local people who've got involved in the COVID response, particularly around loneliness.
Right.
And then I ask them, who do they admire? And then my next conversation is with the person they recommend me to. I don't know if that's a washing line, but you might, because there's something about, you know, I think you said a bit in your summing up, James, but I think it, you know, loneliness is absolutely oppressive and cruel at one extreme, but at the other extreme, as was it Mark talked about his ringing people up, it is something that each one of us, it's within our gift, if we can use the phone or write a letter, to ring someone up and say, you mean something to me and I was thinking about you today, and that touches all of us as human beings. So I think there's something about it being led by sort of people rather than experts for the best tool in the world, or the experts by experience, to use the jargon, which might be something to think about.
I like, by the way, Katie's mum, Mrs. Vanek. I do notice the way that I call everyone by their first name, people I don't know, but Katie's mum, I call Mrs. Vanek. Mrs. V, I like this idea of actually giving everyone a task, that you actually try and see what happened in and reporting back on that. It's a really nice idea. Hugo, are you there? Is that Mrs. V? Who's there?
Oh, it was just me, James. Can you hear me?
Noreena, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, one of the initiatives that I talk about in my book, and I tried to do this in my book, really kind of come at these issues, but through people's stories and people's experiences, and kind of really highlight those. And I think there are, you know, beautiful stories of communities coming together and really coming up with kind of initiatives on the positive side that really can be that you can kind of tell bigger stories through. And one that comes to mind is a bookshop, Ketz, which has created, and bookshops really play traditionally and have played these roles of anchoring and nurturing communities, kind of historically as well as now. And there's one bookshop, Ketz, in Norfolk, and they have created a town-wide book club where everyone reads one book in the whole town. And they have subsidized books, and they have the books are also available at the local library, and the books are read at the local library as well. I mean, this is obviously before the pandemic, but I thought it was, you know, a really beautiful initiative of actually kind of business and the local community coming together to kind of create a shared experience for everyone. And then the author came and kind of spoke at the events. And I think, so I think in terms of inspiring stories, there are many, many kind of beautiful things that are going on, but I also think real people's stories can also show some of the challenges. There was a cafe that I talk about in my book in San Francisco, which used to play an amazingly important role in the local community. It was a place where people would come and knit and sit and chat and didn't feel that they had to be rushed to get a coffee. And this cafe wasn't able to survive the influx of Deliveroo and the equivalent in San Francisco, and the rise in rents, and this place kind of then couldn't exist. And so through those stories as well, you can understand the challenges and how joined up government really needs to be to address some of these issues, you know, because it's not just about what we can do, it's also about having shops that on high streets that are filled and aren't empty. It's about what governments can do to help support local communities and local businesses as well. So I think stories, you're right, James, play a huge role. And Emma, your story was so powerful in, you know, really reminding us that different people's experiences are different, and that we can't be black and white about any of these policy recommendations.
Noreena, I'm going to just ask Hugo Collingridge. Hugo, I wanted to come to you earlier on because you said something early on about having thought you were fine on your own, and then actually the whole experience of this lockdown made you much less sure about how you felt about all that.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear fine?
Yes, that's right. I always had a self-image of myself as someone who was quite comfortable in his own company, but you realise there's a difference between choosing to be on your own and being forced to be on your own. So when you've made a conscious decision, and this something I hold my hands up, I hadn't thought of, to choose to spend time on your own, you can say, I'm happy with my own company, but this lockdown forces you to spend time on your own, which is a different thing altogether. That's what that's what I was getting at, really.
Yeah, I think you're so right, and it's curious, isn't it, how over time that catches up with all of us. I think that has really had an impact. I'm gonna just ask Jennifer Allerton and Naomi Suttendorp have got their hands up. So Jennifer, I'm gonna come to you, then you, Naomi, and then I hope I can come to Mrs. V before we're done. Jennifer, I know I'm sending you Noreena this one. So this one I've got the scribbles in, and this one's coming to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I've forgotten I had my hand up, actually. I think it was about when we were saying how to turn it into a journalistic thing. It was the fact that Emma showed how important the real experience of, like, lived experience is.
Yeah.
And kind of taking that from, if you're talking about certain parts of social policy, taking it from, this is what my life is and this is what it could be.
It's very, I'll say something which is going to sound very callous, but is true, is that, so when you journalistically, I know that we fall into this trap that too often we talk about stories about people's lives and feelings in terms of politics or policy or systems, right? And so we drain all of the heart and the feeling out of those subjects. On the other hand, sometimes what you see is this attempt to tell the individual story, and what's true about your readers or your listeners or your watchers is that at some point they do want to say, yes, but how does that connect to me or to the whole of society? And so that's the thing that I find.
Yeah, that is.
And the thing that I don't like is that sort of case study journalism, which is, here's an example of a thing, right? And it feels very mechanical. So that's what that's funny enough why I love the idea of following a book club and seeing its transformation, or I do like either kind of Mrs. V's example of let's test out and see what happens, or Diana's example of saying, like, following a chain letter, what would happen, knock on one after the other. That's the thing we're trying to find, so that we could take what we've got, which is the beginnings of a conversation, and turn it into something. Sorry, but I
yeah,
I'm bringing you my problems rather than actually coming up with a solution to it. Naomi, do you want to, when are you there? Yes, Heather.
Okay, so the Jewish High Holy Days ended yesterday.
Yes.
And they've been a massive learning experience in terms of how do you take something that is the high point socially of the year and translate it onto Zoom. How do you get it online? How do you even use post? How do you cope? What do you do if your religion tells you not to use Zoom during the High Holy Days? Are you going to change that? What does that mean, going back to the Torah? And mostly we somehow survived it and come through. And then towards the end of the High Holy Days, there's this kind of sort of searching question. How are the Christians going to cope with Christmas? How are they going to manage? And then, can we help them? And then I thought, well, you're asking for stories. You've got a community who's just gone through something that I don't, Pesach gave us a dry run, but Pesach is more to do with your family, really. You don't really do that in shul. This has been, huge and really quite complex. And somehow it's been okay. And I've got friends and family from across the spectrum, from totally secularized and not bothered at all, but like to go to shul or know that shul is happening, who have been relieved to sit in a living room, who had a service going on Zoom, to Orthodox people who've changed their minds and people who've become either more connected, less connected, and so on. But I think that if you're looking for a story in terms of a really practical thing, I'm not sure anybody yet is going to the Jewish community and saying, could you just explain how and what you did? Because we've got Christmas coming up and we're not sure how we're going to look after each other. And we're genuinely worried about the non-Jewish community.
Yeah. That's,
in
by
terms
the way,
of
that's
how are you going to manage? What are people going to do? We know that I'm a social worker, and I hate Christmas because I know that around Christmas people are much more lonely. Suicide goes up, family dysfunction goes up, divorce goes up. We know that people are already struggling, and so if just on a kind of like I don't know, if there was a way of doing some kind of practical support or just breaking it down, like what have we done, and can we share that learning?
Well,
how are we going to help?
Naomi, I'm going to wind up. This is actually really like being back in our newsroom where we're standing around chatting, because now I'm suddenly looking at the time thinking, oh my God, I've got to get home. I'm actually at home and I've got to get to bed. So I'm going to wind up. I'm going to just give Mrs. V the last word, because my co-founder, Katie, I don't know whether Katie Van Exum is here. There you are. So Mrs. V, so what's the idea?
Well, I just think I painted my outside fence. It took me a week.
Yeah.
During that week, I spoke to probably 25 strangers.
Right.
And had conversations with these people every day. They came down, oh, hi, blah, 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 talking about, and learned an awful lot about the people within the community. And just about, it started off by saying, oh, that looks like quite hard work, or you're doing a good job. Very polite conversation. And then every day when you meet them, you talk about something new. So as you go around it used to be a village. I think it's bigger than a village now. You actually are talking to people. I mean, I probably talk to people all the time anyway. But you talk to people and they stop and they listen now. Whereas before it was, oh God, there goes that mad woman. You know,
well,
yes. But now they stop and they talk to you and they converse back with you rather than you just doing all of the talking. They're listening, you're listening, they're talking.
Oh, okay. I'm going to bring us to, and then I saw Lauren Woodhead's, but you've got your hand up. Lauren, is there something you want to say before we go? I feel bad about. Oh, hang on, there you are. Yes. Yeah, we hear you.
It was just a really quick one. With the journalistic thing at the moment, as a student, I feel like a lot of the coverage is looking at like students can't go out and party, and they're just getting junk food, and why are they complaining because they always eat junk food, and it just seems to be looking at it through a very stereotypical lens. And at the moment I can't see somebody for a coffee, so I'm not really worried about going and seeing somebody at a party because I can't see them over a coffee table. And the only person I spoke to today was in John Lewis. I spoke to the lady who I was biting a pan from. And I think we have to look past the stereotypes of just because somebody isn't able to do the things that maybe you don't think they should be doing in the first place, there's always a bigger story behind it. And just because students aren't going out and getting lashed, a lot of students don't do that anyway, and they're still feeling very lonely. And I'm a master's student, but my roommate is a fresher and I know she's finding stuff difficult. My sister's in second year, and even though she's in a house, they've gone into complete lockdown today, so she can't see anybody outside of the 3 people she's living with. So I just think there are so many different things even within that one group of students, and it's kind of back to what Emma was saying, which is that people aren't just the stereotype of what they're portrayed as in mainstream media. Yeah,
well, that's in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to get at, is how you get away from some of this kind of stereotypical reporting or sort of intuitive, instinctive reporting. Listen, I'm going to call an end to it. I am going to notice that Richard Walmsley has essentially, in a nutshell, described this, the after party post-match analysis. This extra section should definitely have a recommendation to bring a glass and everyone's mum. On that note, a big thank you to everyone. Have a very good evening and take care of yourselves.